Hello and welcome to TEDCast, the show that answers the questions on team leaders' minds. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing on the topic of sustainability when implementing changes and how team leaders can make the changes they implement last long term. We're going to be covering some of the discussions that happened during our event at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals in March 2025. Enjoy! Today we're going to be recapping some of the discussions we had at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals with our TED community. We're going to be focusing on the topic of sustaining change and how team leaders can work with their team and use TED to help make lasting changes happen in their team culture. The focus of today's topic will be on encouraging teams how to embed sustainable changes. Also thinking around how teams can keep momentum using the TED approach. And the key learning objectives will be around understanding how to implement and gain the benefits from a continuous improvement culture, identifying opportunities that can help teams achieve success. I began my discussions at the event by talking about examples of teams that I'd worked with over the years in the NHS. An example springs to mind when I've worked with a team who were managing a growing team situation. It was in the wake of the COVID pandemic, and NHS teams were undergoing significant change in the way that they worked, the way they collaborated, and the way they interacted with each other as well as patients. This particular team was experiencing conflict as they tried to grow. New ideas coming into the team may have conflicted with the way things have been done in the past. New members and established members had different views on what was the best way forward, and the team leader wanted some support on how to embed a civility culture and get everyone on the same page for what they wanted to achieve. I was brought in to deliver a session supporting the team on what civility meant and how you can embed it into your team culture practice. Reflecting on the support I provided, the feedback from the session was really positive. The team found new examples of how they could embed civility and work to improve their team culture over time. Their staff survey results following that event increased, and they showed real signs of creating a positive culture throughout their team. The challenge we found, however, was that the change they implemented didn't last. Over time, as the team encountered new changes and new challenges in the way that they were working, old habits began to creep back in. And this story is all too familiar to not just one team, but many teams that I see working across the NHS in different organisations, in different professional capacities, and in different team situations. That often teams who ask for support will gain an initial bounce, but then as future things change and uncertainty arrives, things begin to deteriorate again. And it's not long before they're coming back to us for support. Whilst from an OD perspective, we know we can add value to the way teams work. We can provide things like bespoke workshops on the topics that matters to teams most. We can provide one-to-one coaching for team leaders or team coaching for the team itself. We might even provide off-the-shelf training through certificated programs or recognised packages that we have in our organisations. We might even be able to share resources that team leaders can use to work with their team. One of the biggest challenges that team leaders face is making these interventions last long term and thinking around how they make them stick in their team culture, even when times become difficult. The interventions that we deliver from an OD, HR perspective when supporting teams often helps teams get back on track. It can leave them feeling positive, providing clear direction for where they're headed and clear next steps for how they can work together. Feedback is generally that teams feel confident, they're more self-aware and more able to tackle the challenges they face today. But the challenge that many NHS teams see is that the challenges they face today might be different than the challenges that lie ahead. And often it's really difficult to plan for changes on the horizon, as the external context for NHS teams is constantly changing. If we think about recent years, NHS teams have worked through the COVID pandemic and the changes that that brought about in the way that they worked, the way they interacted with patients. And more recently, teams are coming to terms with what their new ways of working might be, thinking around how they perhaps move back to some of the things they did prior to the pandemic, and how they maybe keep some of the things that they've learned and improved on as they found new ways of working. Many teams are still trying to find yet new ways of working to maximize their resources, to deal with new challenges, and to reshape the service that they provide for the benefits of patients and service users. So why focus on sustainable change? Well, from an OD perspective, we know that in NHS organisations, we only have a limited amount of resource. It's important that we try to improve our capacity to be able to support more teams across our organisations and reduce repetition, because we don't want to be delivering the same sessions year on year with no long-term lasting impact. We want to build the capabilities of our teams and our team leaders so that they can keep the momentum that we might introduce through our initial interventions. And we want to extend our reach so that we can support more and more teams and also target our support at the teams that need it the most. From a team perspective, we want to encourage enhanced efficiency. And research behind change management and continuous improvement shows that when teams get this right, then they can see lasting benefits in the efficiency of how they work, how productive they are. And it also increases innovation and adaptability, so that unforeseen changes on the horizon are not something that derails a team's success. If anything, teams feel more prepared to be able to flex and be dynamic when faced with external change. Research evidence shows that when we focus on a continuous improvement approach, we boost staff engagement and team engagement. And what we've seen over the years from teams that use TED, those that repeat it year on year and go through that TED cycle multiple times, see boosts in their engagement in the annual NHS staff survey. And that has an organisational impact when multiple teams across the organisation are engaging in this way. It helps us to improve quality, but it also improves the way that teams collaborate, both within their team and with other teams across the organisation, and even externally across different organisations. So it helps to create sustainable growth so that any team is better now than they were this time last year, and has the confidence that they're heading in the right direction to be better still this time next year. So this continual improvement approach, focusing on sustainable change, is something we want to encourage in all our teams across the NHS. So the next question is, what are the right changes to make? And this can be really difficult from a team leader's perspective. When we held our event at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals, team leaders acknowledged that it was always challenging to know what were the right changes to make first and what was the team's priority. I think when you're a team leader, you'll have your ideas around what changes need to be made, but making them last and making them work can be really challenging. If you ask the different members of your team, it's likely they will have slightly different perspectives on what changes need to be implemented and what's the best way to go about doing them. And particularly for teams with a large number of members, it's likely you'll have a vast array of different perspectives on which are the most important things to do and how they should go about it, and how each individual team member can contribute to making those changes work. If we ask OD or support practitioners, it's likely that we can offer maybe a case study or a model that might be able to apply to your particular change. We can definitely offer support and advice around what changes could work. But ultimately, it's a combination of all these perspectives that will have the best impact on making change sustainable and making it work. So this is where TED comes in. Something that we encourage all of our team leaders to do at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals and other organisations that are on board with TED is to use this as a continuous improvement approach. It's important to note that the TED approach is not intended to be a one-off intervention. Although teams can see benefits with their first TED because it helps them understand their baseline, their starting point, and helps them understand the direction that they want to head and what those first steps might be. The teams that have the most success with TED are ones that repeat this cycle again and again and again. At Lancashire Teaching, we encourage all our teams to do TED at least once per year. But we know many teams do it more frequently, some do it every 6 months. And if a team is going through some significant changes in the way that they work, they might use TED at several touch points throughout a change project. So maybe every 3 to 4 months at different touch points that feel right to them. And the flexibility in TED allows teams to implement it in the way that suits their particular needs and flex that over time as situations change. This iterative approach helps them to overcome conflicts and differences of opinion because teams have the license to be able to try things and then be confident that they will learn from that and have that opportunity to reflect on whether changes have worked or even if they haven't worked, and be able to build on that to make future changes that will most benefit their team and, most importantly, will last in the long term. The PDSA cycle illustrates really well what we've embedded in TED. I'm sure many clinicians, many practitioners in different fields will recognise this type of model, and really it reflects any type of learning cycle where you would plan the work that you want to do, you would do the work and learn from it as you study and go along, and then based on what you've learned, you will act to make changes in your work to gain improvements in the team. When we apply this to the TED model, it fits in as you'll be planning to do your TED survey. You'll use the TED survey to assess what your current state is, and you'll use your feedback session to host shared learning and compile the views of different members of the team so that you can act and make the best possible decisions based on that shared knowledge and understanding of your team's work. So I asked team leaders in our events, what are the main challenges to making this work? The model is sound, and the PDSA cycle is something that's been used for years and applied to lots of different team working perspectives. But when talking to team leaders, they identified that the challenges can sometimes arise when it becomes difficult to get engagement from the team and get everybody involved in your TED cycle process maybe. Sometimes it can be difficult to bring everyone together for your feedback session to ensure that you get everybody's views into your opinions and actions. So what we discussed is ways that you can encourage that more from your team to get the best possible results from your TED. And the view was that if you follow through the cycle, that each time you repeat this cycle, you'll become that little bit better, both as a team leader and as a team in applying TED in the way that it's intended to work, but also applying it in a way that works for you and your team. Teams that experience challenges getting a large amount of feedback from their team found that when you came back to do TED for the second time, providing you'd implemented some actions that were relevant to the team and based on the feedback you had received, that the second time the team felt more empowered because they understood the process, they understood how TED could help, and also understood what TED can't do and where it isn't appropriate. We found over the years that teams that repeat TED regularly gain a greater understanding of how the feedback process works. They develop psychological safety in the team and feel more supportive and more able to offer their views, with the clear understanding that those views will be taken into account with the way that the team works. So to make change sustainable, it's important to build momentum over time. And whilst your first TED survey might be the most challenging one, it's important to recognise that each time you revisit this process, it will get that little bit easier as the team learns and you learn as a team leader. We talked around where different touch points are in the TED cycle and challenges in between TED activities. And in the group, we discussed how sometimes teams can face challenges in between TED cycles if they feel that they've not met their objectives or maybe been a little bit too ambitious with the actions that they had set. In my experience, aiming for small changes which can be embedded, which can be reinforced regularly, have the biggest impact over time. If you can implement changes in your TED action plan that are easy to implement, things that can apply to every single member of the team, and that you can reinforce and recognise and celebrate at regular intervals throughout your TED cycle, then those have the best chance of becoming part of your team culture. Sometimes teams set off with ambitious actions and are deterred from doing their second or subsequent TED cycles because they haven't achieved those actions yet. My advice to team leaders would be, don't let that deter you from keeping your momentum. Momentum is important with any form of continuous improvement cycle. And with TED, you can use the diagnostic survey and your team feedback discussions to explore why previous actions maybe didn't work the way you intended them to. In doing this, it helps you form better actions each time you revisit TED, because you've understood and learned from your previous experiences, and you're better placed to set realistic actions that will have the biggest impact and that will help your team in the best way possible. In terms of things that can derail the CI process, things the group mentioned were things like resistance to change, maybe a lack of alignment to your team or organizational goals. Sometimes teams experience silo working or poor communication, which can make it difficult to make change last. Often teams are faced with limited resources, and it can be an excuse for not achieving their goals. And sometimes complacency from team members makes it hard to get traction. So this is an example where the momentum you build up will gradually make these things easier to overcome. But it's not to say that your first TED won't be challenging. Sometimes I've known teams only get around 60% response rate in their first TED cycle. And providing that's a significant number of people, I would encourage teams to continue with the process and aim for a higher percentage the next time you revisit TED. That can be one of your key performance measures in terms of how TED is making an impact. If you can get more response rate each time you revisit the cycle, then you can be confident that you are building confidence in the team and that you're building confidence in the TED approach. And over time, that will have a cumulative impact to make sure that everyone in the team feels that TED is an avenue which can help them and can help the team perform to the best of its ability. When I speak with team leaders, I often describe TED in terms of the team development curve. Tuckman's model has been around for many years and still applies well to teams working today. When teams form and come together, they will likely experience a period of storming where they're finding the best ways to communicate, the best ways to collaborate. They're understanding what different strengths and weaknesses team members have so that they can maximize their output when working together. It takes time for teams to get to a stage where they find their norms, their team culture becomes established, and they reach a stage where they can perform to the best of their ability. Tuckman's team curve illustrates that after a team has reached that stage of performing, it's likely they'll eventually reach a stage of adjourning, where they will disband as a team. Now, the model still applies well today, but the reality for many teams is that there aren't just 5 stages of team development. The reality is that this cycle continues again and again and again. You might be a team who's previously reached a stage of high performance, but then a change has meant that you come back to a forming stage and begin to storm or find the best ways of working in your team. When I talked about the experiences of NHS teams over recent years, it's easy to illustrate how teams have been through multiple changes as they've worked through the pandemic, through the other side, and are now dealing with new challenges in today's NHS climate. So in terms of TED, I always think it can be a useful way for teams to navigate that storming stage. And as teams constantly go through flux and change as they go throughout time working in the NHS, TED can be a useful way to help teams establish their norms and decide what is right for us today. By regularly engaging with something like TED, it helps teams recognize that what's right for us today might be different in the future, and that's okay. If you're engaging with TED and you're implementing this continuous improvement cycle, the team can be confident that whatever they decide on today can be adjusted in the future. And as things change, the team will be well placed to be able to dynamically flex to the demands of their service and the external environment. The hope is, and the science tells us, and the teams that have used TED regularly in the past, that teams can achieve new heights each and every time they go through the continuous improvement cycle. Because every time they revisit it, they learn more about who they are, around who they want to be, and the direction they're heading. And it gives them the tools to be able to flex, change direction, and adapt to the needs of different demands from the external environment. I finished off my session by talking about a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's a bestseller that focuses on personal development and how individuals can introduce habits which become lasting. The principles of this book apply really well in a team scenario as well. In his book, Clear sets out 8 steps for adopting habits that can make change sustainable. And in a team context, these are things which can help establish the habits you want to have into your team culture. The key points of these steps are, first of all, to start small. So in a team perspective, you might set off by focusing on your team objectives. Point 2 is around setting clear goals and expectations. So if you're starting small, your first TED cycle might be focused around really getting across that team purpose, getting that shared understanding and getting everyone in your team on the same page around who you want to be, the direction you're heading, and how you get there. Point 3 is that consistency is key. So it's important to find ways to regularly revisit the goals and actions that you set and think around how you can reinforce that positively. The way a team might do this is if you have monthly team meetings, reflecting back on what your actions are and giving credit for examples where those actions have been applied in practice. You might encourage team members to give recognition to each other, reinforcing the behaviours that you want to see in your team. Point 5 sets out how it's important to lead by example. So when you're a team leader, you set the tone for the culture you want in your team. So the decisions that a team makes through TED should be the things which you embody in the way that you interact with team members, the way you interact with other teams, and the perspective you set for your team. It's important to encourage accountability. And from team perspectives, it's important that it's not just you, the team leader, who is holding people accountable for the tone that you set. It's important you encourage the team and think around how you can hold each other accountable. Remembering that if you're challenging each other, you do that in a positive way, which is intended to help everyone learn together and help the team achieve high performance. It's important you take time to celebrate progress. And when you do your second or subsequent TEDs, it's important to reflect on how far you've come. Whilst often in the NHS, we are focused on the next problems or the next challenges that we have to encounter or overcome, it's really important that we take the time to reflect on our previous successes, because this helps to build resilience and build confidence that we're headed in the right direction. By repeating this type of continuous improvement cycle regularly, it helps us to embrace adaptability and be confident that any changes that come from our external horizon are things that we can navigate together. And by celebrating progress, reinforcing positive work that we've done, and reflecting on how far we've come together, it can help your team feel more resilient and able to deal with those external challenges. To support this process, we've recently added 2 new toolkits to the TED system. When you log on, you can search for continuous improvement or CI or even change cycle to find these 2 workshop documents. The first one is a guide for running a team workshop on creating sustainable change. It gives you step-by-step guides for how to encourage sustainable change and involve your team in that process. The second resource is a team journey cycle and helps you illustrate to your team how the TED cycle can be applied to create continuous improvement. It reflects on how change agents can help you embed positive practices into your team culture, and helps you think about communication strategies that will help your continuous improvement work. So in summary, this session encourages teams to start small with their actions. Think of things which can be sustainable, but also can be reinforced regularly through recognition. Our main takeaway was to keep momentum with your continuous improvement work. And if you use TED once, think around when you will use it again and how you will use it to build on those successes. When you come to a second or subsequent TED, if you experience areas which have declined since your previous work, that can still be a useful opportunity to learn together and adapt to what's happening externally. You can use your engagement work to help your team feel more resilient and more able to overcome challenges they face, creating a positive team culture where team members feel supported and able to help each other through the challenges that they face. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you next time. If you're at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals, our upcoming events will be focusing on maximising resources and using artificial intelligence with TED. These will also be future episodes of TEDCast, so if you've not already, please like and subscribe on this video to see those when they appear. Thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll see you next time.